Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carol Lee Makes Cards. Today's card is interactive and features Simon Says Stamps, Spring Flowers 4, and their Quintuple Slider. As you will see, I am using the slider more as a panel slider and not without its hiccups. I began with an ink blended background using bundled sage, ice spruce, tumbled glass, and shaded lilac. I used the same sky colors to stencil in a couple of clouds using Simon Says Stamps, Clouds for Days. The Quintuple Slider comes with 3 dies. The die on your left creates a slider panel that has 4 channels and H flaps that attach it to the main panel. The second die creates slots. The flaps tuck around the 4 bars, creating the slider. I positioned this die in the lower portion of my main panel for die cutting. The slider panel, or the one with the slots, was ink blended using bundled sage and ice spruce. With a little bit of maneuvering and the help of my craft pick, I attached the first flap. The rest of the flaps wrapped around the bars much more easily after the first one was in place. The craft pick was used to push each flap through the slot. While I was working on this, I was wondering if the 2 flaps would have to be held together with a little bit of tape. That was not the case. The flaps held that slider panel in place securely. Because my slider panel is in the lower half of my card, I placed it on top of my main panel. The slider panel would not be exposed, so I needed it to rise higher than what it already was. I undid the flaps on the 2nd and 4th bars, which were shorter runs. This allowed the panel to move fully to the top half of the card. With the slider panel on the top of the main panel, I had to stabilize it so that it wouldn't wiggle around. Strips of ink blended cardstock placed on the sides and the bottom did the trick. I stamped several leafy stems and leaves from Simon Says Stamp, Spring Flowers 4. To create this faux no-line watercolor look, I like to use Tombow markers. The images were stamped with a dark green, a little bit of lilac on Bristol smooth cardstock. A water brush was used to pull the color out. Additional color was added in using the dark green, another medium green, and more lilac. The coloring process was very quick, which was a good thing because I actually did 4 sets of these leaves. I should have mentioned why I work on Bristol smooth paper as opposed to watercolor paper. I wanted the leaves to be consistent in texture with the background panel. Bristol smooth cardstock can withstand a small amount of water. No pilling and little warping made it the perfect choice for this project. I mentioned that there was not a lot of time required to do the coloring. What did take a lot of time was the fussy cutting. And I did have to take a few breaks. The images were cut directly on the line. I took a wider swath along the stems as they were very fine. The stems were touched up with a little bit of color, and then I began layering on the leaves onto the main panel. And this was my big mistake, which you'll see later on. As I built up this leafy panel, I was careful to use glue, particularly on the underside, so that it would be flat and would not impede the slider. I tested it often and all was working well. Using the 3rd die in the quintuple set, I added in the pull detail, which I colored using shaded lilac. The little arrow was embossed with gold and inlaid. Before working on my surprise elements that would slide out of the background of leaves, I decided that I needed a couple more additional branches. I embossed this cute bee image and flower from Simon Says Stamps, Be Happy. I continued my coloring with the Tombow markers. Nothing fancy, just some quick, easy coloring, adding in some color and then pulling it with my water brush pen. I chose to color the flower purple so that it would complement the lilac that was used in the leaves. The bee, of course, had to be yellow and black, but in its wings I did add a little bit of the lilac tone as well. With these two images colored, I was ready to move on to the sentiment. As I mentioned earlier, the sentiments also came from Simon Says Stamps' Be Happy. The main sentiment, Believe, was embossed in gold. I liked that this cute punny take on the word believe gave a hint as to what was going to slide up behind the wall of leaves. The secondary sentiment, Things Will Get Better, was stamped with VersaFine black onyx ink. And back to fussy cutting, but of course this was a lot easier and quicker than cutting out all those leaves. And I had to pop the two elements in and just test it out, and so far everything was working fine. I topped off the bee's antennas with a little bit of gold mustard Nouveau drops. The bee's wings were coated with Nouveau White Blizzard to give them a pretty iridescent quality. I used a low-profile foam tape to attach this panel to an A2 size Neenah Solar White 110-pound card base. I made sure that the foam tape did not come near any of the channels of the slider. Before adding in the elements onto the slider, I just did a double check and some additional glue here and there to make sure that that leafy panel was going to lie nice and flat. I positioned the bee and the flower so that it would be completely hidden by the leaves. And then came the final test. No matter how much I fiddled with it, the slider kept catching. In hindsight, I really should have anticipated this. Fortunately, I was able to remove this leafy panel from the card. I mounted it onto a smaller panel that was inked using the bundled sage and the ice spruce that was used in the background. Avoiding the channels, this panel was attached once again using the low-profile foam tape. I attached the bee onto the slider, making sure that it would be tucked behind all of the leaves when the slider was in the down position. The slider did catch on my initial test, but I was able to figure out that it was just one little leaf that was in the way that I could glue down. A couple of additional leaves to camouflage the channels finished this card. And that wraps up this video on not only what to do, but what not to do, featuring Simon Says Stamps, Spring Flowers 4, Clouds for Days, Quintuple Slider, and Be Happy. As always, I appreciate your visit.